there was a case that was brought through the Hawaii court system that went all the way up to the Hawaii Supreme Court this month. And specifically, it's called State versus Wilson. And basically, the case boiled down to the defendant in the litigation saying that he should have had a right to carry a firearm in public, but the state was trying to say, no, you shouldn't have a right to carry a firearm in public. And it went all the way through the state's Supreme Court. And on January 7th, an actual decision was sent out by the Hawaii State Supreme Court saying a whole lot of really insane things, but in the actual ruling of this case, that the Hawaii State Constitution does not, under any circumstances, afford a right to carry a firearm in public, in a public place, for the purpose of self-defense. That the idea of keeping and bearing arms, which is a very important constitutional phrase that goes all the way up to the federal level for our United States Constitution, does not apply to individuals. It only applies to the collective and specifically applies to militias. And that's not a new concept that people have been trying to litigate. There have been literally countless cases over what the intention behind the Supreme Court decisions in the past have been, over what the intention behind the U.S. constitutional language of the Second Amendment has been. But generally speaking, our court system, all of the litigation about what the Second Amendment means, all of the laws built around the Second Amendment, even with sweeping aims in the other direction, have all boiled down to the language of the Second Amendment of our United States Constitution itself, which says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Period. Full stop. There's been a lot of debate for the last 200 and a half something odd years, whether that does apply to the individual person or to the militia, but it literally says point blank in the Second Amendment to the Constitution, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Basically, what the Hawaii State Supreme Court said on January 7th was, no, actually, that's not true. We do have the right to infringe as the government on your individual right to keep and bear arms, and that at least in our state, there is no right for you as a person to carry a firearm in a public place for self-defense. Let me just pause right there. I'm just going to pause right there because that in and of itself is a really controversial thing to say. You might be watching this stream today and think, well, I don't really support the Second Amendment. I am not really a gun person. I've never fired a firearm. I've never even held one in my hands. I have no interest in being a Second Amendment advocate. How does this even apply to me? I might even support the idea of no individual rights to keep and bear arms. Fine. We can have that conversation here in just a minute because really this case is just in flagrant violation of existing precedent at the federal level for the Supreme Court, but also existing constitutional law. We'll come back to the firearms part of this in a second. But this should at least concern you on where this goes from here, right? Is it just now that we don't believe constitutional rights exist within the scope of the Second Amendment? Or does the Hawaii State Supreme Court think this expands far beyond any individual's right to keep and bear arms, that maybe this might involve your rights to freedom of speech, your rights to freedom of worship, your rights to freedom of assembly, your rights to due process, maybe even your right to vote? And I know that sounds crazy, right? That sounds so hyperbolic, tinfoil hat, conspiracy theory. This would never apply to any other constitutional right. Yeah, if you're thinking that, think a freaking again, because in the 53-page document that is the unanimous opinion, unanimous, not a single dissenter, from the Hawaii State Supreme Court, if you scroll all the way down to page 40 of this document of 53, you'll come across a little segment that looks like this. And basically they're providing like a PhD level dissertation on why, in their opinion as state Supreme Court justices, the Constitution is wrong. They basically spend 40 pages explaining that to you and how every single legal decision ever before this is wrong. And then they add in this little blurb in one sentence, tucked away, middle of the page on page 40, assuming nobody is ever going to read it. Luckily, I like to read, and I am a huge legal nerd, so I decided to read it. As the world turns, as time goes on, it makes no sense for contemporary society to pledge allegiance to the founding era's culture, realities, laws, and understanding of the Constitution. That's in their words. The Hawaii State Supreme Court justices say, essentially, and now I'm paraphrasing, but I just read you the direct quote, the Constitution doesn't apply at all from how it was written to today in 2024 because 1776 was so long ago. And there's just no freaking way that anything we ever wrote that long ago would ever apply to culture and society today. And then for good measure, they throw in a quote from The Wire on HBO. I never saw that show. Apparently this episode aired in 2006 because that is super professional as a Supreme Court justice to quote an HBO show to make your point on constitutional law. But, you know, I digress. The thing about the old days, they're the old days. That's the quote that they had to put in there. So again, in other words, just because something was written a really long time ago means inherently it does not apply to modern culture. It does not apply to modern society. And essentially we should just throw the entire thing out because contemporary life is dramatically different than life back then. Interesting. I have infinite problems with that line of thinking when it comes to constitutional law. But let's just play that game for a second, right? The question is, and especially if you're watching from another country, you guys might not know this about the United States Constitution, but there's kind of a saying that we say about this in our founding documents. Was it written for the time, or was the U.S. Constitution and our Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and all of our founding documents written to stand the test of time? We like to say the latter, that our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence was written not for the limited scope of the era that they lived in, but with the vision envisioned by our founding fathers to stand the test of time forevermore, that generations into perpetuity, until we ruin it ourselves, basically, would be able to live with these basic inalienable, meaning they belong to you, not belong to the government, rights, privileges, and opportunities in society that no one on earth up to that point had ever enjoyed. Ever. The idea of the United States of America, of a constitutional republic, of a Bill of Rights, was a brand new concept in 1776. And they call it the American experiment for a reason. It never existed before. No one ever knew if this was going to last and stand the test of time. But they wrote these documents with the intention of them standing the test of time, not just for their era, to borrow the phrase from the state Supreme Court of Hawaii. So if that's the case, if we genuinely believe that the Supreme Court's decision here is accurate, that they're saying the Constitution no longer applies to contemporary culture, to contemporary law, to contemporary realities, then I think it begs the question, should we have a right to freedom of speech in modern society? Should we have a right to worship freely in contemporary culture? Should we have a right to due process under the law, to the presumption of innocence until we are proven guilty in modern society? Should women have the right to vote in modern society? Because that falls under the Constitution. Does that even matter for contemporary culture? How about civil rights? Should you have basic inalienable rights regardless of your individual identity, your disability status, the color of your skin, your original nationality? Should those go away because they don't fit into contemporary culture? I would say no, but that's exactly what this sentence that they decided to throw in here means. That's exactly what this means. If that's the case, if we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, do we not have a separation of the three branches of our government? Do we not have checks and balances in our government anymore? Can the president become the legislative branch and just do what he wants at will with the scope of one swish of his pen? Do we have no enforcement of our laws anymore, as is the job of the executive branch? Do we have no representative democracy in electing people to represent us at the state, local, and federal levels of government in the legislative branch? Do we even have elections? Do we have an election day in society if the Constitution no longer applies to contemporary culture? These are questions that bear answers, that require answers. If actual Supreme Court justices at the state level of any of the 50 states are to just throw carelessly an argument like this into the wind, we at least deserve answers to those questions, because the entire framework of our governance structure, the entire framework of American society is built on the back of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And if all of a sudden that no longer applies to contemporary culture, realities, laws, and understanding of the Constitution, then we may as well just not even have a Constitution at all.